The radio crackled with urgent voices as Captain Sarah Martinez gripped the controls of her Apache AH-64 helicopter, hovering 500 feet above the dusty Afghan terrain. What happened in the next 8 minutes would not only save dozens of American lives, but would also shatter every assumption her male colleagues had ever made about women in combat aviation. In those 8 earth-shattering minutes, this 28-year-old pilot from small-town Texas would eliminate 15 enemy targets with surgical precision, execute maneuvers that defied military textbooks, and prove that courage has no gender. Her story begins not with the thunderous roar of Hellfire missiles, but with a quiet determination forged in the cotton fields of her childhood and tempered in the unforgiving crucible of military training. This is the true story of how one woman's split-second decisions during a Taliban ambush would echo through the halls of the Pentagon, inspire a generation of female pilots, and force the military establishment to confront their own biases about women in warfare. It's a story of precision under pressure, of breaking barriers while breaking enemy lines, and of how sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most desperate moments. What you're about to read will challenge everything you think you know about modern warfare, female empowerment, and the thin line between life and death in the world's most dangerous skies. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan, as Captain Sarah Martinez completed her pre-flight inspection of the Apache helicopter. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking every bolt, every wire, every system that would keep her alive in the hostile skies above Kandahar province. The desert air was already shimmering with heat, though it was barely 7 in the morning. Sarah had always been methodical, a trait that served her well in the cockpit of one of the world's most sophisticated attack helicopters. At 28, she was younger than most of her fellow Apache pilots, but her precision and calm under pressure had earned respect from even the most skeptical veterans in her unit. Still, she could feel the weight of their doubts, the unspoken questions about whether a woman belonged in the cockpit of a machine designed for one purpose, to kill. Growing up in Sweetwater, Texas, population 10,000, Sarah had never imagined she would one day be piloting a $30 million war machine over the mountains of Afghanistan. Her childhood was spent helping her father repair tractors and combines on their modest farm, her small hands surprisingly adept at working with complex machinery. While other girls her age were playing with dolls, Sarah was learning the intricate dance between man and machine that would later serve her so well in military aviation. The path to this moment had been neither straight nor easy. When Sarah first announced her intention to join the Army after high school, her mother had cried for 3 days straight. Her father, a Vietnam veteran who rarely spoke about his service, had simply nodded and said, "If you're going to do it right." It was the closest thing to a blessing she would get from her family. Basic training at Fort Benning had been a brutal introduction to military life. Sarah was one of only 12 women in a company of 200 soldiers, and the drill sergeant seemed to take particular pleasure in testing her limits. She remembered the 20-mile ruck march in Georgia's oppressive summer heat, her 60-pound pack feeling like it weighed twice that much. While male soldiers twice her size collapsed from exhaustion, Sarah kept putting one foot in front of the other, her mind fixed on a simple goal: prove them wrong. The decision to pursue aviation had come during a demonstration at Fort Rucker. Sarah watched in awe as an Apache helicopter danced through the air, its pilot manipulating the massive machine with the delicacy of a ballet dancer. The power, the precision, the sheer technological marvel of it all spoke to something deep inside her. That night, she filled out the paperwork to begin the most challenging training program the Army had to offer. Flight school was 18 months of hell. The academic coursework alone was enough to wash out half the candidates. Sarah found herself studying flight dynamics, weapon systems, and tactical procedures until 2 or 3 in the morning, then reporting for physical training at 5. The Apache helicopter was not just a machine, it was a complex ecosystem of sensors, weapons, and defensive systems that required a pilot to think like a tactician, engineer, and warrior all at once. Her first time in an Apache simulator, Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of the cockpit. Hundreds of switches, displays, and controls surrounded her, each one critical to the helicopter's operation. The instructor pilot, a gruff chief warrant officer named Jackson, watched skeptically as she struggled with the basic controls. "Martinez," he said through the intercom, "the Apache doesn't care about your feelings. It's not going to be gentle with you because you're a woman. Either you master this machine, or it will kill you and everyone counting on you." Those words became Sarah's mantra. Every simulated mission, every training flight, every classroom session was an opportunity to prove that she could master the machine that had broken so many others. She memorized the technical manual until she could recite weapon specifications in her sleep. She practiced emergency procedures until they became muscle memory. Most importantly, she learned to think not just as a pilot, but as a weapon system operator, capable of delivering devastating precision firepower. The gender dynamics in flight school were complex and often frustrating. Some instructors treated her no differently than the male students, which she appreciated. Others seemed determined to find reasons why women shouldn't be flying combat aircraft. The worst were those who went easier on her, assuming she needed special consideration. Sarah learned to navigate these attitudes while maintaining focus on her ultimate goal, earning her wings and proving that she belonged in the cockpit. One particularly challenging exercise involved a night insertion mission in mountainous terrain. The scenario called for precise navigation through narrow valleys while avoiding simulated surface-to-air missiles and delivering troops to a hot landing zone. Sarah's flight partner, a cocky lieutenant named Bradley who had made his opinions about women pilots clear, seemed determined to showcase her failures. The mission began smoothly enough, but as they approached the target area, Bradley began questioning her navigation decisions over the intercom. His constant second-guessing threw off her timing and concentration. When they arrived at the landing zone 3 minutes late, Bradley was quick to blame Sarah's flying for the mission failure. That night, Sarah sat alone in her barracks room, questioning whether she was cut out for this life. The phone call home to her parents only made things worse. Her mother begged her to come home and find a normal job, while her father remained stoically silent on the other end of the line. The next morning brought a surprise visit from Colonel Patricia Hayes, one of the Army's first female Apache pilots and now commander of the Aviation Training Brigade. Colonel Hayes had heard about the previous night's mission and wanted to speak with Sarah personally. "Martinez," the colonel said as they sat in her office, "I'm going to tell you something that might shock you. Half the male pilots in this program right now will never see combat. They'll serve honorably, but they'll never be tested in the way that defines a true warrior. You, on the other hand, are going to face challenges they can't even imagine. Not because you're less capable, but because you're different." Colonel Hayes leaned forward, her voice taking on an intensity that made Sarah sit straighter. "The enemy won't go easier on you because you're a woman. Your fellow pilots won't give you the benefit of the doubt when lives are on the line. You're going to have to be better, faster, and more precise than everyone around you. Not because it's fair, but because that's the reality of breaking barriers."
The conversation lasted 2 hours, covering everything from tactical doctrine to the psychology of leadership under pressure.
When it ended, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The doubt and frustration that had been eating at her was replaced by a cold, determined focus. She wasn't just training to be a pilot anymore. She was training to be the kind of warrior who could carry the hopes and expectations of every woman who would follow in her footsteps. The remaining months of flight school passed in a blur of intensive training and gradual improvement. Sarah's scores climbed steadily in every category: gunnery, navigation, tactical decision-making, and crew coordination. More importantly, she began to feel the Apache respond to her commands as if it were an extension of her own body. The complex machine that had once seemed impossible to master now felt like a natural partner in a deadly dance. Graduation day arrived with typical military ceremony and fanfare. As Sarah received her pilot wings from Colonel Hayes, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The small-town girl who had once helped her father fix farm equipment was now qualified to operate one of the most sophisticated weapon systems ever created. But earning her wings was just the beginning. The real test would come when she deployed to Afghanistan. The assignment to Forward Operating Base Chapman had come as something of a surprise. Sarah had expected to be assigned to a larger base with more established facilities. Instead, she found herself at a remote outpost in one of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan, flying missions against a Taliban force that had grown increasingly bold in recent months. Her unit, the 3rd Battalion, 159th Aviation Regiment, had a reputation for aggressive tactics and precision strikes. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Stone, was a veteran of 3 combat tours who had little patience for pilots who couldn't perform under pressure. During Sarah's initial briefing, he made his expectations clear. "Martinez," he said, looking up from her personnel file, "I don't care if you're male, female, or Martian. In this unit, we have one standard: excellence. You'll fly the missions you're assigned, execute them with precision, and bring your aircraft and crew home safely. If you can do that, we'll get along fine. If you can't, you'll be on the next transport back to the States." The other pilots in the unit were a mixed group of veterans and newer aviators, most of whom had been flying combat missions for months or years. Sarah's arrival created a subtle shift in the dynamic of the squadron. Some of the pilots welcomed her with professional courtesy, while others seemed to be waiting for her to prove herself in combat before accepting her as a full member of the team. Her first few missions were routine reconnaissance flights and escort duties for supply convoys. Sarah found herself frustrated by the lack of action, though she understood that her commanders were giving her time to acclimate to the operational environment. Afghanistan was unlike anything she had experienced in training. The terrain was harsh and unforgiving, with mountains that seemed to stretch endlessly towards the horizon, and valleys that could hide entire enemy forces. The people were equally complex. During convoy escort missions, Sarah would see villages that seemed frozen in time, with mud brick houses and terraced fields that looked unchanged from centuries past. Yet hidden among these ancient settlements were sophisticated enemy fighters equipped with modern weapons and communication systems. The Taliban had proven adept at blending traditional guerrilla tactics with contemporary technology, making them a formidable opponent even for the most advanced military forces. 3 weeks into her deployment, Sarah received her first real taste of combat. During what was supposed to be a routine patrol mission, she was flying as co-pilot with Major Tom Harrison, a veteran aviator with over 800 combat hours. Their mission was to provide overwatch for a convoy traveling through a known danger area about 40 kilometers south of the base. The convoy consisted of 6 vehicles carrying supplies and personnel to a smaller outpost deeper in the mountains. Intelligence reports suggested minimal enemy activity in the area, but Sarah had learned to treat every mission as potentially dangerous. As they approached the convoy route, everything seemed normal. The vehicles were maintaining proper spacing and speed, their radio communications calm and professional. Then, without warning, the lead vehicle disappeared in a massive explosion. Sarah watched in horror as the armored truck simply vanished in a cloud of smoke and debris, the victim of a sophisticated improvised explosive device. Before she could fully process what had happened, muzzle flashes erupted from concealed positions on both sides of the narrow road. Major Harrison immediately began coordinating with the convoy commander while maneuvering the Apache into a position to provide fire support. Sarah found herself thrust into her first real combat situation, her heart pounding as she worked to identify enemy positions and coordinate targeting data. The enemy fighters were well concealed and disciplined, their positions carefully chosen to maximize the effectiveness of their ambush. For 20 minutes, Sarah and Major Harrison provided covering fire while the convoy extracted casualties and fought their way out of the kill zone. Sarah's first shots in anger were fired that day, her 30mm cannon rounds precisely placed to suppress enemy positions without risking friendly forces. When the engagement finally ended, 3 American soldiers were dead and 7 more wounded, but the convoy had successfully extracted from the ambush site. That night, Sarah lay in her bunk replaying every moment of the engagement. She thought about the soldiers who had died, about the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death, and about the terrible responsibility that came with operating such a powerful weapon system. For the first time since arriving in Afghanistan, she truly understood what Colonel Hayes had meant about the weight of expectations that came with her role. The engagement had also marked a turning point in her relationship with her fellow pilots. Major Harrison's after-action report praised her performance under fire, noting her calm demeanor and precise weapons employment. Word spread quickly through the small community of the forward base, and Sarah noticed a subtle but significant change in how the other aviators treated her. She was no longer the new pilot who happened to be a woman. She was a combat-tested aviator who had proven herself when it mattered most. The weeks following Sarah's first combat engagement brought a steady rhythm of missions that gradually built her confidence and reputation within the squadron. Each flight revealed new aspects of the complex conflict playing out across Afghanistan's rugged landscape. She learned to read the terrain not just as a pilot navigating through mountain valleys, but as a warrior understanding how geography shaped the eternal dance between hunter and hunted. Captain Jake Morrison became her regular co-pilot after Major Harrison was reassigned to a staff position at brigade headquarters. Morrison was a 32-year-old warrant officer from Oregon with over 400 combat hours and a reputation for aggressive tactics. Unlike some of the other pilots, Morrison seemed genuinely pleased to be flying with Sarah, appreciating her methodical approach to mission planning and her steady hand on the controls during complex maneuvers. Their partnership was tested during a mission that would become legendary within the squadron. Intelligence had identified a high-value Taliban commander operating from a compound in the remote Arghanda Valley. The target, known by the codename Red Jacket, had been responsible for coordinating several recent attacks against coalition forces, including the convoy ambush where Sarah had first seen combat. The mission brief was delivered by Lieutenant Colonel Stone himself, emphasizing the importance of eliminating this particular target. Red Jacket was believed to be meeting with other senior Taliban leaders to plan a major offensive against coalition positions in the region. The intelligence was time-sensitive. The window of opportunity would close within hours. Sarah and Morrison launched their Apache just before dawn. The helicopter loaded with a full complement of Hellfire missiles and 30 MMA ammunition. Their call sign for the mission was Reaper 21, a designation that would take on special meaning before the day was over. As they flew through the pre-dawn darkness toward the target area, Sarah reviewed the mission parameters one final time. The compound was located in a narrow valley surrounded by steep mountains, making approach and escape routes limited. Intelligence suggested the presence of at least 12 enemy fighters, possibly more, armed with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. Most concerning was the possibility of man-portable surface-to-air missiles, which could pose a serious threat to their helicopter. As they approached the target area, Morrison took primary control while Sarah managed the weapon systems and sensor suite. The Apache's advanced targeting system allowed them to observe the compound from several kilometers away, identifying heat signatures and movement patterns that confirmed the intelligence reports. There were indeed multiple individuals moving around the compound, and their behavior suggested heightened security awareness. The attack plan called for a single Hellfire missile strike on the main building, followed by cannon fire to suppress any survivors. Sarah armed the missile system and began the complex process of target designation, using the Apache's sophisticated sensors to paint the exact impact point. The missile's guidance system would do the rest, delivering its 18-pound warhead with surgical precision. "Reaper 21, you are cleared hot," came the voice from the Tactical Operations Center. Sarah squeezed the trigger, sending the Hellfire streaking toward its target. The missile's flight time of just under 30 seconds felt like an eternity as she and Morrison watched the thermal display, waiting for the explosion that would signal mission success. The Hellfire struck the building with devastating effect, collapsing the entire structure in a massive fireball. Secondary explosions suggested the presence of ammunition or explosives inside the building, confirmation that they had hit a legitimate military target. Sarah was preparing to deliver follow-up cannon fire when Morrison's urgent voice crackled through her headset. "Missile launch. Brake right, brake right." Sarah looked up from her targeting display to see a trail of smoke rising from a concealed position about 800 meters to their east. Someone on the ground had fired a surface-to-air missile at their helicopter, and it was tracking directly toward them. Morrison threw the Apache into a violent evasive maneuver, the aircraft dropping altitude and changing direction so rapidly that Sarah felt her stomach lurch. The missile missed by less than 50 meters, detonating harmlessly in the air behind them. But even as Sarah felt relief wash over her, she realized their situation had become much more complicated. The enemy had not only survived their initial attack, but had revealed the presence of sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons that posed a direct threat to their survival. "We need to neutralize that launcher," Morrison said, his voice calm despite their near-death experience. "Can you get a lock on the position?" Sarah was already working the problem, using the Apache's sensors to identify the source of the missile launch. The enemy position was well concealed among a cluster of boulders on the hillside, but the heat signature of the recently fired missile was still visible on infrared. She designated the target and prepared to engage with the 30mm cannon. The canyon erupted in a deadly game of cat and mouse. As Sarah's cannon rounds impacted near the missile position, automatic weapons fire began erupting from multiple locations around the valley. The enemy had clearly prepared for the possibility of air attack, positioning fighters in concealed positions throughout the area. Tracer rounds streaked past their helicopter as Morrison maneuvered aggressively to avoid the ground fire. What followed was 15 minutes of intense combat that tested every skill Sarah had learned during her training. She engaged target after target with precision cannon fire, while Morrison flew the helicopter through a complex aerial ballet designed to minimize their exposure to enemy fire. The Apache's armor protected them from small arms fire, but Sarah was acutely aware that a lucky shot from an RPG could end their mission permanently. During the engagement, Sarah experienced something that many combat pilots describe, but few civilians can truly understand. Time seemed to slow down, allowing her to process information and make decisions with crystalline clarity. She could track multiple targets simultaneously, coordinate with Morrison on tactical maneuvers, and maintain communication with their Tactical Operations Center, all while under intense enemy fire. The turning point came when Sarah identified a group of fighters attempting to set up another missile launcher on the opposite side of the valley. The range was extreme for the 30mm cannon, requiring her to account for bullet drop, target movement, and the helicopter's own motion. She fired a long burst, walking the rounds onto target with devastating effect. The secondary explosion that followed confirmed the destruction of the missile system. When the engagement finally ended, Sarah and Morrison had eliminated 11 confirmed enemy fighters and destroyed 2 missile launches. More importantly, they had prevented the Taliban from launching their planned offensive against coalition positions. The mission was being hailed as a tactical masterpiece at the brigade level, but Sarah felt only exhaustion and a growing awareness of how quickly things could go wrong in combat. The flight back to base gave her time to reflect on what had just happened. She had fired her weapons in anger multiple times, taking human lives in defense of her own life and mission. The theoretical discussions about the morality of warfare that had filled her college philosophy classes seemed irrelevant now. In the cockpit of an Apache helicopter, there were no moral abstractions, only the immediate reality of kill or be killed. Back at Forward Operating Base Chapman, the debriefing session lasted 3 hours. Intelligence officers wanted to know every detail about the enemy positions, their weapons, and their tactics. Aviation maintenance crews needed to inspect the helicopter for damage from the enemy fire they had received. Medical personnel wanted to ensure that neither Sarah nor Morrison was suffering from combat stress reactions. The mission report would eventually make its way up the chain of command to the Pentagon, where senior officers would study the engagement as an example of effective close air support tactics. But for Sarah, the most important feedback came from her fellow pilots, who had monitored the radio traffic during the engagement and understood exactly what she and Morrison had accomplished. Chief Warrant Officer Davis, a crusty veteran with over 1,200 combat hours, approached Sarah after the debriefing. "Martinez," he said, "that was some fine shooting up there today. Word of advice, though, the enemy learns from every engagement. They'll be better prepared next time, and they'll be looking specifically for Apache helicopters like yours. Watch your 6 out there." Davis's warning proved prophetic. Within a week of the successful mission against Red Jacket's compound, intelligence reports began indicating increased Taliban interest in anti-aircraft weapons. Intercepted communications suggested that the enemy was actively seeking more sophisticated missile systems and was training additional personnel in their use. The threat environment was evolving, and Sarah found herself studying new tactics and countermeasures during her off-duty hours. The Apache was a formidable weapons platform, but it was not invulnerable. Enemy forces around the world had developed increasingly effective methods for engaging attack helicopters, and the Taliban were proving to be quick learners. Her next significant mission came 2 weeks later, when intelligence identified a convoy of Taliban fighters moving through the mountains near the Pakistani border. The convoy was believed to be carrying weapons and ammunition to supply enemy forces in the region, including possibly more surface-to-air missiles. The mission was designated as a high-priority interdiction operation, meaning that failure was not an option. Sarah and Morrison launched in the early morning hours, joined by a second Apache crew, led by Captain Angela Torres, another female pilot, who had arrived at the base just a month earlier. Torres was an experienced aviator with deployments to Iraq and Syria, and her presence marked the first time that 2 female pilots had flown together on a combat mission from Forward Operating Base Chapman. The convoy consisted of 6 vehicles moving along a dirt road that wound through the mountains like a serpent. From their observation position several kilometers away, Sarah could see that the vehicles were maintaining proper tactical spacing and appeared to be well armed. Thermal imaging revealed multiple personnel in each vehicle, suggesting this was indeed a significant enemy force. The attack plan was complex, requiring precise coordination between the 2 Apache helicopters. Torres and her co-pilot would engage the lead and trail vehicles first, trapping the convoy in a kill zone. Sarah and Morrison would then engage the remaining vehicles with Hellfire missiles and cannon fire. The entire engagement was planned to last no more than 3 minutes, minimizing the enemy's opportunity to respond with anti-aircraft fire. As they moved into attack position, Sarah felt the familiar calm that came over her during combat operations. Her breathing slowed, her vision sharpened, and her mind began processing information with computer-like efficiency. Every switch position, every weapon setting, every aspect of the helicopter systems were exactly as they should be. Reapers 21 and 22, you are cleared hot. Came the authorization from the Tactical Operations Center. Torres' helicopter attacked first, her Hellfire missile striking the lead and trail vehicles with devastating precision. The convoy immediately stopped, with surviving fighters pouring out of the damaged vehicles and seeking cover among the rocks scattered throughout the area. Sarah's first missile struck the second vehicle in the convoy, creating a massive secondary explosion that confirmed the presence of ammunition or explosives. As she prepared to engage the third vehicle, automatic weapons fire began erupting from multiple positions around the convoy. The enemy was well trained and disciplined, quickly establishing defensive positions and returning fire against both helicopters. The engagement that followed would later be studied at aviation schools as an example of how quickly air-to-ground combat could evolve into a complex tactical situation. The Taliban fighters had clearly learned from previous encounters with Apache helicopters, employing tactics specifically designed to counter the aircraft's advantages. They spread out to prevent single weapons from engaging multiple targets, used the terrain to limit the helicopter's fields of fire, and concentrated their own fire to force the aircraft to maneuver defensively. Sarah found herself engaging individual targets with precision cannon bursts while Morrison maneuvered to avoid increasingly accurate enemy fire. The Taliban fighters were using armor-piercing jerking ammunition that could penetrate the Apache's protection, and several rounds had already struck their aircraft. Warning lights flickered on her instrument panel, indicating minor damage to non-critical systems. The tactical situation became even more complex when Torres's helicopter reported being engaged by what appeared to be a shoulder-fired missile. The missile missed, but its presence confirmed intelligence reports about the enemy's improved anti-aircraft capabilities. Both helicopters were now operating in an environment where a single mistake could result in catastrophic loss. Working together with deadly efficiency, Sarah and Torres systematically eliminated the enemy positions. Sarah's cannon fire was precise and devastating, each burst carefully aimed to maximize casualties while conserving ammunition. Her target selection was flawless, prioritizing threats based on their weapons and positions rather than simply engaging the closest enemy fighters. When the engagement ended, the convoy had been completely destroyed and 17 enemy fighters had been eliminated. More importantly, a significant quantity of weapons and ammunition had been prevented from reaching Taliban forces in the region. The mission was another tactical success, but Sarah understood that each engagement was teaching the enemy valuable lessons about how to fight Apache helicopters. The flight back to base was subdued, both crews processing the intensity of the combat they had just experienced. Sarah counted 7 bullet holes in their helicopter, a reminder of how close they had come to disaster. One round had struck just inches from Morrison's side of the cockpit. A sobering reminder that survival in combat often came down to mere chance. That evening, Sarah sat in the small chapel on base, thinking about the lives she had taken and the larger purpose of their mission in Afghanistan. She thought about the American soldiers who were safer because of the weapons shipment they had destroyed, and about the Taliban fighters who would never again threaten coalition forces. The moral calculus of warfare was complex and deeply personal, but Sarah was finding her own peace with the choices she was making. The debriefing session that followed Sarah's 8-minute engagement lasted nearly 6 hours. Intelligence officers wanted every detail about enemy positions, tactics, and weapons. Aviation maintenance crews needed to assess the damage to a helicopter, which had taken 17 hits from enemy fire. Medical personnel conducted stress evaluations to ensure that both Sarah and Morrison were psychologically fit for continued operations. The damaged Apache told the story of their harrowing mission in stark detail. Bullet holes peppered the fuselage, with several rounds having passed within inches of critical systems. One round had struck the armored glass of Morrison's side window, leaving a spiderweb of cracks that spoke to how close they had come to disaster. Another had penetrated the aircraft's tail boom, missing the drive shaft by less than 2 inches. Lieutenant Colonel Stone conducted the tactical debriefing personally, recognizing the significance of what his pilots had accomplished. The engagement had not only saved the convoy but had provided valuable intelligence about Taliban capabilities and tactics. The enemy force had demonstrated a level of organization and equipment that exceeded previous assessments, suggesting that coalition intelligence estimates needed significant revision. Martinez, Colonel Stone said as the formal debriefing concluded, "What you and Morrison accomplished out there today represents exactly the kind of performance this unit is known for. Your target selection was flawless, your weapons employment was precise, and your tactical decision-making was exemplary. This engagement will be studied at the highest levels as an example of effective close air support." Word of the engagement spread rapidly throughout the coalition command structure. Within hours, senior officers from brigade and division headquarters were requesting detailed reports about the action. The combination of Sarah's performance and her status as one of the few female Apache pilots in Afghanistan made her story particularly compelling to military leaders who were still debating the role of women in combat aviation. The convoy commander, Major Stephen Burke, made a special trip to Chapman 2 days later specifically to thank Sarah and Morrison personally. Burke, a 20-year Army veteran with multiple combat deployments, was effusive in his praise for their actions. "Captain Martinez," Burke said as they met in the base operations center, "I've been in combat for over a decade, and I've never seen anything like what you did for my soldiers. Your actions saved lives, period. My wounded are alive today because of your skill and courage under fire." Burke went on to describe the engagement from the ground perspective. painting a picture of a desperate situation that had been turned around by precision air support. His convoy had been facing annihilation in a carefully planned ambush when Sarah's missiles began eliminating enemy positions with devastating accuracy. The psychological effect on both friendly and enemy forces had been immediate and decisive. The personal commendations began arriving within a week. The first was a Bronze Star with V device for valor, recognizing Sarah's courage under fire and her life-saving actions during the convoy engagement. The citation praised her exceptional skill and bravery in the face of determined enemy resistance, noting that her actions had directly resulted in the preservation of American lives. More significant was the Distinguished Flying Cross that followed 2 weeks later. The DFC was one of the military's highest decorations for aviation achievement, rarely awarded to junior officers. The ceremony was conducted by Major General Patricia Collins, commander of the Regional Aviation Brigade and one of the highest-ranking women in Army aviation. General Collins used the ceremony to make a broader point about the capabilities of female combat aviators. "Captain Martinez represents the best of military aviation," she said to the assembled crowd at Forward Operating Base Chapman. "Her actions demonstrate that courage, skill, and dedication to mission accomplishment are not determined by gender. She has proven that women can excel in the most demanding roles our military has to offer." The ceremony was attended by personnel from across the region, including many pilots who had heard about Sarah's engagement through the informal networks that connected aviation units throughout Afghanistan. For many of them, Sarah's performance represented validation of arguments they had been making about women in combat roles for years. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from her fellow pilots in the squadron. Chief Warrant Officer Davis, the crusty veteran who had offered Sarah advice after her first major engagement, approached her after the ceremony with a simple statement that meant more than any formal decoration. "Martinez," he said, "you've earned your place here. Nobody questions your capability anymore. You're one of us now, and that's something no medal can give you." The recognition brought unexpected challenges. Media attention began focusing on Sarah as a symbol of women's expanding roles in the military. Reporters requested interviews, and senior Army officials suggested that she might be valuable as a spokesperson for recruiting efforts targeting young women interested in aviation careers. Sarah found herself uncomfortable with the attention, preferring to focus on her mission rather than the broader social implications of her gender. In conversations with her family back in Texas, she expressed frustration with the media's tendency to emphasize her gender rather than her professional accomplishments. "Mum," she said during one particularly difficult phone call home, "they keep calling me a female pilot instead of just a pilot. I didn't train for years and deploy to Afghanistan to prove a point about women in the military. I came here to do a job, and that job is protecting American soldiers." Her mother, Margaret Martinez, had watched her daughter's transformation from small-town farm girl to decorated combat aviator with a mixture of pride and concern. The recognition Sarah was receiving validated Margaret's belief in her daughter's capabilities, but also highlighted the dangers she faced every day in Afghanistan. The psychological impact of the engagement was complex and deeply personal. Sarah found herself replaying those 8 minutes in vivid detail, analyzing every decision and every shot. Combat psychologists explained that this was a normal response to intense combat experiences, but the knowledge didn't make the memories any less vivid. Sleep became difficult, with dreams often featuring the thermal images of enemy fighters moments before her missiles struck their positions. Sarah was acutely aware that her actions had resulted in the deaths of at least 15 human beings, men who had families and histories and dreams that ended in the explosion of American ordnance. The base chaplain, Captain Robert Hayes, proved to be an invaluable resource during this period of adjustment. Chaplain Hayes was himself a combat veteran who understood the unique moral challenges faced by warriors who had taken enemy lives in defense of their comrades. "Sarah," he said during one of their conversations, "what you're experiencing is the normal response of a moral person to the terrible necessities of warfare. The fact that you feel the weight of those deaths is evidence of your humanity, not weakness. The enemy fighters you engaged were trying to kill American soldiers. Your actions prevented that from happening." The conversations with Chaplain Hayes helped Sarah develop a framework for understanding her actions within the broader context of just warfare theory. She wasn't a killer who enjoyed taking lives, she was a warrior who used deadly force to protect innocent people from those who would harm them. The distinction was philosophically important and personally necessary. Training exercises took on new meaning after the engagement. Sarah found that her performance in simulated combat scenarios had improved dramatically, as if the intense pressure of real combat had unlocked capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. Her weapons accuracy scores reached near-perfect levels, and her tactical decision-making demonstrated an intuitive understanding of complex combat dynamics. Morrison, her co-pilot during the engagement, became more than just a fellow aviator. He had shared those 8 minutes of terror and triumph with her, creating a bond that extended beyond normal professional relationships. Their crew coordination reached levels that other pilots envied, with each seeming to anticipate the other's actions and decisions. "You know what I realized during that engagement?" Morrison said to her one evening as they sat in the small recreation tent watching a movie. "I realized that all the training, all the simulations, all the textbook scenarios couldn't really prepare us for what we experienced. When things went to hell, we just had to trust our instincts and each other. And it worked." The broader implications of Sarah's performance were being discussed at the highest levels of Army leadership. Her engagement had provided compelling evidence for arguments about expanding women's roles in combat aviation, but it had also raised questions about whether current training programs were adequately preparing pilots for the realities of modern warfare. A team of analysts from the Army's Training and Doctrine Command visited Chapman to interview Sarah and Morrison about their experience. They were particularly interested in understanding how the stress of combat had affected their decision-making processes and whether current training scenarios accurately reflected the complexity of real engagements. "Captain Martinez," said Colonel Jennifer Williams, the lead analyst from TRADOC, "your performance during that engagement exceeded what our models predicted was possible under those conditions. We need to understand whether your success was due to exceptional individual capability or whether there are training improvements that could help other pilots achieve similar results." The interviews and analysis sessions were exhausting but professionally valuable. Sarah found herself articulating aspects of combat aviation that she had never consciously considered, examining the thought processes and decision-making frameworks that had allowed her to perform so effectively under extreme pressure. One particularly interesting aspect of the analysis focused on gender-specific performance characteristics. Some researchers theorized that women might have natural advantages in certain aspects of combat aviation, particularly in multitasking and precision weapons employment. Sarah was skeptical of such generalizations but participated in the research because she believed it might help future female aviators. The attention also brought unexpected personal challenges. Letters began arriving from young women across the country who had heard about her story and were considering military careers. Sarah felt a responsibility to respond thoughtfully to these communications, knowing that her words might influence life-changing decisions. One letter from a 17-year-old high school student in Alabama named Jennifer Thompson particularly affected her. Jennifer wrote about her dream of becoming a pilot and her concerns about whether women were truly welcome in combat aviation roles. Sarah spent hours crafting a response that was both encouraging and realistic about the challenges women faced in the military. "Jennifer," she wrote, "the military is changing, but change is never easy or automatic. You will face skepticism, discrimination, and challenges that your male colleagues won't experience. But you will also have opportunities to serve your country in ways that previous generations of women could never imagine. If aviation is your passion, pursue it with everything you have. The military needs talented pilots, regardless of gender." Meanwhile, the operational tempo at Chapman continued at its usual intense pace. Sarah flew regular missions, participated in training exercises, and maintained her aircraft, all while adjusting to her new status as one of the most decorated pilots in the squadron. Other aviators treated her with respect that bordered on reverence, acknowledging her proven abilities while expecting continued excellence in future missions. The enemy also seemed to have learned from the engagement. Intelligence reports suggested that Taliban forces were actively seeking more sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons, partly in response to the devastating effectiveness of attack helicopter operations in the region. Sarah's success had made her and other Apache pilots higher priority targets for enemy forces. This evolving threat environment required constant adaptation in tactics and procedures. Sarah found herself working with intelligence analysts to develop new approaches to combat missions that would minimize the risks posed by improved enemy capabilities. Her combat experience made her input particularly valuable in these planning sessions. 3 months after the engagement, Sarah received notification that she was being recommended for promotion to major, well ahead of her contemporaries. The accelerated promotion was recognition of her demonstrated leadership capabilities and combat effectiveness, but it also carried implications for her future assignments and responsibilities. The promotion ceremony was conducted by General Collins, who made the trip back to Chapman specifically to pin the new rank on Sarah's collar. The general used the occasion to announce that Sarah was being assigned to a new position at brigade headquarters, where she would help develop training programs for other female aviators entering combat roles. The The assignment was a significant career opportunity, but it also meant leaving the tight-knit community of combat aviators she had come to think of as family. Chapman had been her home for over a year, the place where she had proven herself as a warrior and earned the respect of her peers. Leaving would be emotionally difficult, but she understood that her new role would allow her to help other women follow in her footsteps. The transition from forward operating base Chapman to brigade headquarters at Bagram Airfield marked a profound shift in Sarah's military career. Where Chapman had been a small, tight-knit community focused on daily combat operations, Bagram was a massive logistics and administrative hub where strategy was planned and policy was implemented. For Sarah, it represented an opportunity to influence the broader direction of women's integration into combat aviation roles. Her new position as Assistant Operations Officer for Training Development carried responsibilities far beyond anything she had previously experienced. Sarah found herself working directly with senior officers to design training programs that would better prepare future Apache pilots for the realities of modern combat. Her first-hand experience from the 8-minute engagement had made her a subject matter expert whose insights were valued at the highest levels of command. The office she was assigned overlooked the massive flight line at Bagram, where dozens of aircraft launched and recovered daily in support of operations throughout Afghanistan. From her window, Sarah could watch Apache helicopters departing for missions similar to the ones she had flown from Chapman, a constant reminder of the operational reality that drove all their planning efforts. Major Jennifer Chen, Sarah's supervisor in the new position, was a career aviation officer who had been instrumental in developing policies for women's expanded roles in the military. Chen immediately put Sarah to work on a comprehensive review of Apache pilot training programs, with particular focus on preparing aviators for the complex threat environment they would face in Afghanistan. "Sarah," Major Chen explained during their first meeting, "your combat experience gives you credibility that none of the rest of us can match. When you speak about what works and what doesn't in training, people listen. We need to use that credibility to make real improvements in how we prepare pilots for combat." The work was intellectually challenging and professionally rewarding. Sarah found herself analyzing training scenarios, reviewing after-action reports from across the theater, and working with simulation specialists to create more realistic combat exercises. Her goal was to ensure that future Apache pilots would be better prepared for the kind of complex, high-intensity engagement she had experienced. One of her first projects involved developing new tactical scenarios specifically designed to train pilots in precision weapons employment under extreme pressure. Sarah worked with computer programmers to create simulations that replicated the chaos and stress of real combat, using data from her own engagement to ensure authenticity. The psychological aspects of combat preparation proved particularly important. Sarah collaborated with military psychologists to develop training modules that would help pilots manage the stress and moral complexity of taking enemy lives. Her own experience with post-combat adjustment gave her unique insights into the emotional challenges that aviators would face. "The textbooks can teach you how to fire a Hellfire missile," Sarah explained to a group of instructor pilots during a training conference. "But they can't prepare you for the moment when you realize that each of those explosions represents human lives ending. We need to help pilots understand and prepare for that psychological reality." The training programs Sarah helped develop began showing immediate results. Pilots graduating from the new curriculum demonstrated improved performance in complex scenarios and better tactical decision-making under pressure. More importantly, they seemed better prepared psychologically for the moral weight of combat operations. Sarah's reputation continued to grow within the broader aviation community. She was invited to speak at conferences and symposiums across the United States, sharing her experiences and insights with military and civilian audiences. These speaking engagements gave her a platform to advocate for continued expansion of women's roles in combat aviation. One particularly significant speaking engagement was at the Women in Military Service for America Memorial in Washington, D.C. The audience included senior military officers, members of Congress, and young women considering military careers. Sarah's presentation focused on the evolution of women's roles in combat and the continuing challenges they faced. 10 years ago, she told the audience, the idea of women flying Apache helicopters in combat was controversial. Today, it's becoming routine. But that progress came because individual women were willing to accept the challenge of proving themselves in the most demanding environments the military could offer. Each generation builds on the achievements of those who came before. The speech was well received and led to additional opportunities for Sarah to influence policy discussions about women in the military. She found herself consulting with Pentagon officials on proposals to eliminate remaining restrictions on women's participation in certain military occupational specialties. Her personal life during this period was complicated by the demands of her new responsibilities and the continuing attention from media and advocacy groups. Sarah had been briefly married to a fellow pilot during flight school, but the marriage had ended in divorce when the pressures of military life and dual deployments proved too much for their relationship. Dating was challenging for someone in Sarah's position. Her combat record and public profile made it difficult to find partners who weren't intimidated by her achievements or who weren't interested in her primarily because of her fame. She found herself feeling isolated, despite being surrounded by colleagues and admirers. The relationship she eventually developed with Captain Michael Torres, an intelligence officer she met at Bagram, grew slowly out of mutual respect and shared professional interests. Torres was himself a decorated veteran who understood the unique challenges of military life without being threatened by Sarah's achievements.
Sarah, Torres said during one of their early conversations, I've read about what you did at Chapman, but what impresses me more is what you're doing now, using that experience to help other people succeed.
That takes a different kind of courage. Their relationship provided Sarah with emotional stability during a period of intense professional pressure. Torres understood the demands of her work and supported her advocacy efforts while providing the personal connection she needed to maintain her psychological health. Meanwhile, the war in Afghanistan continued to evolve. Taliban forces had adapted their tactics in response to the effectiveness of coalition air power, developing new weapons and procedures that posed increasing threats to aircraft like the Apache. Sarah's work took on additional urgency as she helped develop countermeasures for these emerging threats. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces were specifically targeting female pilots, viewing them as high-value propaganda targets. Sarah received enhanced security briefings and was advised to vary her routines and movements to reduce her vulnerability to potential attacks. The irony wasn't lost on her that her success had made her a target precisely because she was a woman. The threat became real during a coordinated Taliban attack on Bagram airfield 6 months into her assignment. Sarah was in her office when the first rockets impacted the base, followed by ground attacks against the perimeter defenses. The attack lasted 4 hours and resulted in significant damage to base facilities, though casualty numbers were kept relatively low by effective defensive measures. During the attack, Sarah found herself helping to coordinate the defense of the aviation headquarters building, using her combat experience to organize personnel and establish defensive positions. Her calm leadership during the crisis impressed her colleagues and demonstrated that her combat skills remained sharp, despite months away from flight operations. The attack also reinforced her commitment to improving pilot training. This is exactly why we need to prepare our aviators for complex threat environments, she told Major Chen after the base was secured. The enemy is constantly adapting, and our training has to evolve to meet new challenges. Sarah's growing reputation led to an unexpected opportunity when she was selected to participate in a joint training exercise with British and Canadian forces in the United Kingdom. The exercise was designed to test multinational cooperation in complex combat scenarios, and Sarah was chosen to represent American expertise in attack helicopter operations. The 3-week exercise proved to be both professionally valuable and personally enriching. Working with pilots from other nations gave Sarah new perspectives on tactics and procedures, while the international environment allowed her to see her own experiences within a broader context of global military cooperation. British Army Air Corps Captain Emma Hartley became both a professional colleague and personal friend during the exercise. Hartley was one of the first women to fly Apache helicopters for the British military and had faced many of the same challenges that Sarah had encountered. The interesting thing about being a pioneer, Hartley observed during one of their conversations, is that you don't get to choose the responsibility. People are watching everything you do, looking for evidence to support their preconceptions about women in combat roles. The pressure never really goes away. Their friendship provided Sarah with someone who truly understood the unique pressures of being a visible female combat aviator. They maintained regular communication after the exercise, sharing experiences and supporting each other through the challenges of their respective careers. Sarah's tour at Bagram ended with her promotion to lieutenant colonel and assignment as the operations officer for an Apache squadron being redeployed to Fort Hood, Texas. The assignment represented both a homecoming and a new challenge, as she would be responsible for helping the squadron transition from combat operations in Afghanistan to training operations in the United States. The change of command ceremony at Bagram was attended by senior officers from across the theater, recognition of Sarah's contributions to improving aviation training and her role in advancing women's participation in combat aviation. General Collins, who had become something of a mentor to Sarah, delivered remarks that placed her achievements within the broader context of military evolution. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez represents the best of what happens when we judge people by their capabilities rather than their demographics, General Collins said to the assembled crowd. Her combat record speaks for itself, but her contributions to training development will have an impact that extends far beyond any individual engagement. She has helped prepare hundreds of pilots for the challenges they will face, and in doing so, she has made the entire force more effective. The transition back to the United States was emotionally complex. Sarah was glad to be returning home after nearly 2 years in Afghanistan, but she also felt a sense of loss at leaving the operational environment where she had proven herself. The intensity and purpose of combat operations had given her life a clarity that would be difficult to replicate in a peacetime training environment. Her parents met her at the airport in Dallas, and Sarah was struck by how much they had aged during her deployment. The stress of having their daughter in combat had taken its toll, despite their pride in her achievements. Her father, who had said little about her military career over the years, surprised her with his emotional response to her safe return. "Sarah," he said, as they drove through the familiar Texas countryside toward Sweetwater, "I want you to know how proud your mother and I are of what you've accomplished. When you first told us you wanted to join the Army, I was scared for you. I never imagined you would achieve what you have." The conversation with her parents helped Sarah understand how her military career had affected not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who cared about her. The recognition and achievements had come at a cost that extended beyond the personal sacrifices she had made. Fort Hood represented a new chapter in Sarah's career, one focused on leadership development and organizational management rather than individual combat performance. Her squadron included dozens of pilots and maintenance personnel, all looking to her for guidance and direction. Many of them were aware of her combat record and expected her to bring operational expertise to their training programs. The challenge of leading experienced aviators in a peacetime environment proved different from anything Sarah had previously encountered. Combat operations had provided clear objectives and immediate feedback. Training operations required patience and long-term vision. Success was measured not in enemy targets destroyed, but in the gradual development of pilot skills and unit readiness. Sarah found herself drawing on lessons from her entire military career as she worked to build an effective training program. The precision and attention to detail she had learned as a pilot translated well to administrative responsibilities. The combat experience gave her credibility with subordinates, who knew she had proven herself under the ultimate test of warfare. One of her first initiatives was implementing training scenarios based directly on real combat engagements, including her own 8-minute action at Chapman. She worked with simulation specialists to create realistic replications of the tactical situations pilots might face in future deployments, ensuring that training was as relevant and challenging as possible. The goal isn't to recreate specific engagements, Sarah explained to her staff during a planning meeting. The goal is to create training scenarios that develop the kind of tactical thinking and precision execution that will serve pilots well regardless of what specific situations they encounter in combat. The program proved successful, with pilots showing marked improvement in complex scenario performance and tactical decision-making. More importantly, the training seemed to better prepare aviators for the psychological pressures of combat operations, an aspect that Sarah considered crucial based on her own experiences. As Sarah settled into her new role at Fort Hood, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a small farm in Texas to a position of significant influence within the military aviation community. The 8 minutes of combat that had made her famous represented just one moment in a longer story of personal growth, professional development, and service to her country. The young woman who had once helped her father repair farm equipment had become a decorated combat veteran and influential leader whose decisions affected the careers and capabilities of hundreds of other service members. More importantly, she had helped prove that courage, skill, and dedication to duty were not limited by gender, opening doors for future generations of women who would serve in roles that had once seemed impossible.
Looking toward the future, Sarah understood that her story was part of a larger transformation taking place within the American military.
The barriers that had once limited women's participation in combat roles were gradually falling, not because of political pressure or social activism, but because individuals like herself had proven their capabilities under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The 8 minutes that had changed everything were now part of military history, studied by tacticians and inspirational to young women considering aviation careers. But for Sarah, they represented something simpler and more personal. Proof that she belonged in the cockpit of an Apache helicopter, that she could protect American soldiers when they needed her most, and that the dreams of a small-town Texas girl could indeed soar above the mountains of Afghanistan and into the highest levels of military leadership. Her legacy was being written not just in the official records of combat engagements and training innovations, but in the careers of the female pilots who would follow her path. Each woman who strapped herself into the cockpit of a combat aircraft would carry forward the example Sarah had set, that excellence was the only standard that mattered, and that courage had no gender limitations. The story that began with Sarah Martinez gripping the controls of her Apache helicopter above the Afghan desert would continue through the achievements of countless other women who would serve their country in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. In proving that she belonged in combat aviation, Sarah had helped prove that the future of military service was limited only by individual capability and dedication, not by outdated assumptions about gender roles. The 8 minutes that surprised everyone had indeed changed everything, creating ripple effects that would influence military policy, training procedures, and individual careers for decades to come. Sarah Martinez had not just been a successful combat pilot, she had been a catalyst for transformation within one of America's most important institutions, proving that sometimes the most significant battles are won not through the destruction of enemy forces, but through the breaking down of barriers that limit human potential.